Wayne is the person who brought the Saito conducting technique to the entire Western world, basically. Because it originated in Japan, it's taught in Japan, but if I understand it right, Wayne is the person that really brought it to Canada and America. Is that correct?
Well, I suppose because of my work with the textbook and the workshops I've organized, uh, when Professor or when Mr. Ozawa came to Canada in the early 1960s to conduct the Toronto Symphony, the curiosity about the cytoconducting method began. So there were people such as Clifford Evans and Alec Pauk and others who had gone to Tokyo to study, who were people who I met in my early stages of studying the method. So I think that I've certainly been a proponent and I've shared as much as I can. But there were these other people who preceded me.
Okay. Um, and then Brittany, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Brittany Cordy, and I'm from Saskatoon, and I've been studying the Saito method for about almost 3 years now, and I teach elementary band and direct my church choir.
And you took the workshop 3 times so far.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and I'm Matt. I've been studying conducting for like 5 years. And 2 years ago, or only like a year and a half ago now, I discovered the Saito method by taking the workshop, and I got obsessed like right away because when I learned about it, to me it was the most obvious thing. I was like, wow, everyone should be doing this. So I've been sort of devoting myself to slowly learning it over the past 2 years. Um, the other point I should make too is Wayne is the person who did you translate the textbook or you just edited or transcribed it into English?
I worked with a colleague, Fumihiro Torigai, who taught in Saskatchewan. He did the actual translation, and I edited it based on what I'd learned in my studies in Tokyo and in further discussions with Professor Okabe.
Okay. And I also wanted to start with some corrections from the previous interview. So, at the previous interview, the first thing I said was that Saito is the only like technical conducting method. And that's not really true because every conducting method has technique to it. But what I meant to say was Saito is the only conducting method that teaches you about the velocity and the angle of the baton. Would you agree with
That's,
that?
that's a fair statement. I've just received a document from a young man in Spain who has compared the different um, diagrams for the various meters. And it seems to me that we miss the whole point of the diagrams if we don't understand how the changes of velocity are what helps the players predict where the beat point is going to be. So we all know that we can place a beat point just about anywhere in the field of beat. But the most critical part of it is that it has to be readable by the ensemble, and it also has to be useful to the ensemble. So, yes, I think that what we're looking at here is uh, the incredible benefit of understanding the acceleration and deceleration and how the secondary point and its placement in space and time really is the key element in all of this to, first of all, make the Saito method unique, and secondly, to make it particularly useful.
Yeah. So I've taken all sorts of conducting symposiums throughout like America, and I've come to the conclusion that either the college professors in America they either don't know about how changes in velocity and angle affect the sound, or they just didn't tell me about it. It's one of the two. Because like with all these symposiums I've taken, I've watched so many people conduct, and I've never once heard a conducting professor mention anything about the changes in the velocity and in the angle. And to me, that's like the only thing we even should be talking about for the most part. And it's like
I, absolutely.
Yeah, they're missing like the most important thing, like changes in angle and changes in velocity.
Absolutely. And of course, what we've come to understand is that in the entertainment industry, which is conducting and ensemble playing, so much of what's involved now has to do with the personality on the podium. And there are lots of people who are extraordinary musicians who are put in a position where they're going to be conducting. And they haven't studied the technique. And it's disappointing, frankly, that many are reluctant to open their minds and to share ideas. And that's why it's so exciting to have a chance to work with people from all over the world who are open-minded and very sharing and bright people who say, the amount of rehearsal time that's available to most ensembles has been reduced dramatically. And that becomes a critical part of it. If we watch videos from times past, we can see that a lot of the work that was done happened in rehearsals. And frankly, still a lot of the work that needs to be done is done in rehearsals. But there's so little time to do it now compared to what it used to be because of economics and one thing or another. So the idea then of reaching the pinnacle of a performance has somehow eluded a lot of people. And I'm also concerned about how do we share? What are the kinds of things that we can share openly with people where they can start to become free enough to think about it, to experiment with it, and then to make it their own?
So my hunch is that the really good conductors, whether they're professors or orchestra conductors or what, my hunch is that they intuitively, the good ones might intuitively understand about velocity and angle, but they don't have the vocabulary that Saito has to teach about velocity and angle. Do you
I
agree with
think
that?
I think that the sequence of study that Saito set up is very valuable, and I haven't seen it anywhere else. I think that the other aspect of it is that, frankly, if you look at what happens at a lot of workshops, the technical dimension of conducting is not addressed in as comprehensive a way as we try to do it using Saito's ideas.
And there's certainly no vocabulary for it
Yes.
outside of Saito, certainly none. And it's weird because if you were to describe conducting to someone and you say like, oh yeah, you can show freezing in music by changing the velocity and the angle of the baton, then you might assume that that would be taught at some point, but it's just not outside of Saito.
The preparation of students, particularly in North America, is considerably different than I found in Japan. Many of the young musicians in Japan at an early age are doing ear training and music dictation that would confound most university students. So the idea of that kind of exposure, of a challenge to a high level of instrumental performance and so on, is something which is not particularly common throughout North America. So we often find people coming into the university who need a lot of help to catch up on the ear training and theory aspects of their musicianship, and it leaves almost no time for conducting. So that's part of the challenge.
Yeah.
So thank you for your input, Brittany. Yep.
Yep, just hang out over here.
Yeah, Brittany's questions are coming. We have them in
They
queue.
are, yes.
But first, another correction from the last video is you wanted to give a better, concise definition of if someone asked you, what is the Saito method?
Yes. The Saito method, of course, involves this training of the arm. And it's done through a series of studies and exercises. I think it's important for people to know that those who have learned the Saito method early on often took some of these ideas and approached it differently. So the pedagogy of teaching the Saito method varies from person to person. For example, there's a professor who I met in Tokyo who likes to spend a lot of time working on basic exercises. And before you even get to the music, my work with Professor Okabe was just was the opposite, where he said we need to incorporate our study of the gestures by learning real music.
Who was the other professor? The first one that you said was more interested in the exercises.
I have his book, but I don't have his name.
Okay.
But I mean that I think you'd find that there are a lot of people who do that. They're really concerned about, for example, how do you make a particular beat pattern, but they are more interested in tracing a path. So the Saito method involves the training of the arm, learning how to apply the gestures to certain specific studies, and then being able to move on beyond that to the broader range of music. At the school in Tokyo, they include some other, I would suggest, some standard pieces. The Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun is one. Certainly the First Symphony of Brahms is another one, and so on. So the idea is that it becomes progressive as people develop the technique. It's a combined technique and musical study.
That makes sense. So, Brittany.
All right. So I think part of what Matt and I were talking about, part of the reason for doing this is to get people who maybe have never heard of Saito or are a little bit curious, give them an idea of what they can expect and the benefits of it. So one of my questions I had was, what were your first impressions when you were first studying the Saito method?
On the road trip from Saskatoon to Vancouver Island, where I attended the first workshop, I discussed with my good friend Jack how we hoped to get some interpretation of some of the standard orchestral repertoire. The first lesson, we were confronted with trying to drop our arms, and we couldn't do it. Nobody in the class could drop their arm. And one of the situations was that we worked in what I've affectionately called Jinglish, which means Japanese and English combined, but most of the teaching was done by demonstration. So I would suggest that most of us were overwhelmed by our lack of technique. And I think that's been common with my students, where they have some pretty good musical ideas, but trying to figure out which way to move their arm is the problem. So I was fortunate that I had bought a Video Rover video camera setup back in the 1970s, and I was able to videotape all of the sessions. And it was from those, in repeating it over and over and over again, that I would start to be able to understand how these gestures worked and how they were attached to the music.
And when you say people couldn't do the arm drop, I think I've seen that before, where I tried to teach some people how to do it, and they'll usually have like a few muscles that just won't relax.
That's right.
Right.
I was one of those people. I remember you coming over and we're working on arm, because it's something that you take for granted. Oh, I can drop my arm, but can you really drop your arm? Can you actually let go?
Because we're talking about a dead arm drop, like literally, like you got shot by a sniper and your arm drops.
Yes, although that certainly is an American description of a way to do it.
Sure.
Yeah.
In Japan and Canada, we try to avoid the guns.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've mentioned a lot of Saito teachers that you've had and you've worked with. Can you give the timeline of who leads to who? Like it started with Saito analyzing the conductor of his orchestra. Can you give the timeline of what teacher led to what teacher?
I'll try. Saito gives credit to Joseph Rosenstock, a Jew forced out of Germany who went to Japan about 1936. And he established an orchestra there that became the National Broadcasting Orchestra of Japan, NHK. That wasn't what it was called originally. So Joseph Rosenstock was Saito's teacher. But we also have to remember that Saito, as a principal cellist of the orchestra, was exposed to all kinds of conductors. And there's an interesting video on YouTube showing some of the conductors from as far back as the 30s. And most of the famous conductors from the world were invited to come to conduct that orchestra in Japan. So you can see little brief recordings of all kinds of conductors, such as Ernest Ansermet, and on and on and on. So Professor Saito established a class for conductors, and Morihiro Okabe, who was one of my teachers, was in that first class with a handful of other people. And we're talking now about the time of the Second World War, and slightly after that, when Saito and some colleagues created the Toho Gakuen School of Music. It started out as a girls' school, and eventually it's expanded to a university. From there, the next cohort of conductors were people such as Seiji Ozawa and Kazuyoshi Akiyama, and they went out and really showed what they were able to do, and certainly wowed a lot of people, brought a lot of attention to what was going on in Tokyo. But then there were many, many others who grew up through this. From my perspective, a marvelous contributor and pedagogue was Morihiro Okabe. He told me that he was one of the students in the early class who was asked to write the section for each of the studies. And then that was used along with the teaching notes of Saito to create the textbook. So he wasn't afraid to try to make some changes, make some corrections. And I think probably the most notable one is Study 5, which is the slow movement of the First Symphony of Beethoven, where as a study, the use of that senyu gesture to start it is fabulous with two pianists. It's useless with a full orchestra. So what they've discovered is that, it needs to move on. It needs to be applied in different ways. So the idea of using some pieces as studies, but not necessarily as the one and only way of approaching a piece of music, is really critically important. And Saito himself, through the textbook, says, now that you've been able to do it this way, try it this other way, and try to expand your idea about how to make it work. So from my perspective, going from Rosenstock to Saito to Okabe, to me and a few others who've taught bits of Saito, Dr. Gerald King in University of Victoria has been influenced that way. And then on to another group of people who I worked with through a variety of workshops, including the two of you. So that's the kind of, I suppose, line. But others would be able to point to a number of other people who had studied at Toho Gakuen, who maybe were instrumental specialists, who have gone on and done some other conducting. There are so many others who are fabulous, fabulous conductors. Naoto Otomo, who's conducted in Kyoto and certainly in Tokyo, is a fabulous young conductor in Japan. He has a close association with Ellen Gilbert, who recently left the New York Philharmonic. So I would hope that this whole notion of rethinking about how we approach the gestures and the training of conductors has gradually expanded. And I know that there are lots of others who have come from the school who are doing some teaching. And that becomes the really critical part of it. We don't want it to be dogmatic. We want it to be instructive.
So, Brittany,
Yes.
you're up here, by the way.
What?
You're up here, by the way.
Oh, okay. You're over here. So I was wondering where you're pointing. That was a cue or what that was.
That's you right there.
Okay, there's me over there. All right, I'm up. So I think you've already sort of alluded to this a little bit, just with the comment about the arm drop. But just for someone who doesn't know, has no experience with Saito, again, what kind of physical differences do you notice between the Saito method and other conducting methods, like in terms of arm tension, for example?
One of the most obvious is in deliberate use of acceleration and deceleration. The other is in the specific use of a from-point gesture such as haniage. So in that brief exercise that I use to teach the intermediate preparatory motion, we have initially that shakui gesture, then the haniage gesture. The combination of those is unique. One of the people I studied with, this was John P. Painter at Northwestern University, had a beautiful shakui beat and didn't understand why everybody couldn't do that. And of course, this has been called focal point or focal plane conducting. He didn't use from point gestures. As a matter of fact, he said all beats are down beats. So there have been quite a few different approaches to how all of this works. I think that the critical element is that we want to think about how can we develop, and that the method books, and I've tried to buy every one that I can find, tend to spot check various kinds of challenges. So, for example, the use of fermatas. You'll find that every conducting textbook has lots of exercises on fermati, whether that blends in with a particular piece of music or not. However, it doesn't necessarily lead you to being able to have a broad variety of fermatas that you might come across in a piece of music. So the technical aspects of the arm drop, I haven't seen any other method that teaches a gesture like tataki. Most of the time, the really energetic gestures tend to be from point, like the shunkanundo. So it becomes like a jab or a punch. And of course, we know that people will respond to those sudden kind of motions. The conductors may get more accent than they want. So the idea of thinking about how does my gesture, excuse me, elicit and shape sounds within the ensemble is really the critical part here.
So you mentioned from point gestures a few times in that.
Yes.
Could you define that for someone who doesn't know?
Yes. The typical gesture, talked about shakui or scooping, has four different elements. One is the before point motion, then there's the actual beat point, then there's the after point motion, and then the secondary point, which is that place in space and time where the motion is the slowest. When we're thinking about a from point motion, what we are thinking about is a burst from a point. We often think about it coming off a hot stove. So the critical part here is that it has a beat point and an after point, but it doesn't have a before point motion as such, and it doesn't have a secondary point. So if we think of the secondary point as the critical element in allowing someone to predict when the beat point will occur, this from point motion basically moves along with the gesture. It comes too late to influence the beat that's going to happen.
And the secondary point is the point where you're up here. And
generally it occurs at the apex, that's right.
Yeah, and that's where the decisions are made, whether it's going to be that or if it's going to be that.
Well, of course, the essence of this is that we have a pretty good idea from the piece of music that we're dealing with, either because of what's written on the page or what the historical performance is. So we've already got a lot of information that we can work with in order to make it easy for the ensemble to play together. That's the other really critical element here, is that we're not working as improvisers just out of the blue. So the secondary point coming typically at the top is part of a timed sequence. And so we can tell by where we are in that sequence when the next gesture is, when the next beat point is going to occur.
Okay. Who would you say are some of the prominent people that use Saito now? I don't know if there's very many, but
Well, there are lots of people who use it in part. I referred to Alan Gilbert. He's studied the Saito method, but he doesn't use it consistently, and it's certainly I can see it in some of his gestures.
and Alan
Now,
Gilbert works. He conducts which orchestra?
well, Alan Gilbert did conduct the New York Philharmonic until recently. He's since moved to Sweden. He's been doing a lot of work with Berlin Philharmonic. Naoto Tomo has done a lot of extraordinary work in Japan. He's also conducted in Hawaii. I think of Mr. Akiyama, Mr. Ozawa. There's a fellow who I was going to say a young fellow, but he's not young anymore, by the name of Totsuka, who won several prizes at Tanglewood in Boston, who has fabulous technique. And then lots of other people who have been influenced by the kinds of things that we've done at workshops, who have gone on to do a lot of their other things. Ken Shea, who conducts the Vancouver Metropolitan Orchestra and does a lot of work in Japan, was Professor Okabe's last student. So much of his work has been influenced by Saito's ideas.
Do you ever have any connection with him? If he's still going over to Japan and he does Saito, do you ever have any communication or connection with him?
With Ken?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, you do? Okay, cool. Brittany.
My cue again. All right. So, in your experience, if you step in either as a guest conductor or starting with a new ensemble, how long does it usually take for them to adjust to reading the Saito gestures?
Probably a 1/12 of a second from the first arm drop. There are some people who have a concept about playing behind the beat. But of course, when most of the ensemble is already playing with you, they recognize that they will stand out and not be part of the ensemble if they do it. Mm-hmm. I've often suggested that conducting needs to develop a respectful collaboration between the conductor and the ensemble. So there are some ensembles that are open and warm and welcoming, and will respond really beautifully. There are others who are rather reluctant. And so it becomes a combination of everything from how we would greet the ensemble, perhaps even just using our eyes and looking at each individual, to the kinds of opening remarks that we would make, to the kinds of ways that we would approach the first piece of music. So, for example, if I decided I was going to start a piece of music and I didn't like it and I cut it off and I started it again and cut it off and did this several times without any explanation of the orchestra, I would expect they would get frustrated and say, this guy is just playing games with us. But generally it doesn't take a long time, because I'd like to believe that the gestures are useful and intuitive. And if they're not useful, then we need to change. We need to change them.
So
have you got?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, Have you like had lots of good feedback from orchestras or groups that you've worked with and saying, "Oh, this is a lot clearer than I've usually seen," or is that usually not communicated?
Yes, I think that when I conducted an orchestra in Japan, they understood what I was doing. And I didn't have the fluency in the Japanese language to do it, and they did a good job of playing it. When I worked with the people in Boston, they were very comfortable working with the gestures. And of course, the idea of how we work with this kind of thing together, we know that if the ensemble will feel subdivision, if the ensemble performers will feel subdivision, we're already well on our way to being able to deal with this. So if one approaches the ensemble with respect, I think that it's reasonable to expect that you'll get the respect back, and people are interested in moving on. You know, most of the time, it's a matter of effectiveness. We have something to do. How can we accomplish this in the most reasonable, effective way? If I were to ask most of an ensemble to just sit and wait patiently while I tried to figure out what to do with a particular passage, you can imagine that people will become impatient and say, you know, you're not well prepared, you're wasting our time, and we've got a concert coming up.
Yeah.
So figure it out. Let's get on with it. You know, that's the essence of it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had a student who wasn't going to learn Saito, but you could change one thing to make them better or more clear, like what advice would you give to someone who doesn't want to dive deeply into Saito, but could still learn from it?
Well, I guess the challenge is like any technique. If you don't want to learn, then I can't teach you. So I would hope that people would want to make the ensemble play better. That's the essence of it. Make it easier for the ensemble to play, and then ultimately be able to express some of their musical ideas. And of course, the musical ideas include things like how do we control the dynamics? What's the phrasing like? Professor Saito said, "I can show you the way to go to Tokyo, but you have to make the trip yourself." So essentially, all that I can do is to share it. But in my experience with responding to videos, I think that the more specific I can be in saying, here's a problem spot. Here's a way that you might try to think about solving the problem. Think about wiping or scooping or, you know, pounding, dropping your arm if you want to have something happen that way. So there's a certain humility, I guess, that we expect out of people who are doing any musical studying. And if you had a chance to study with the finest percussionist in the world, one would say, I hope that you have both ears open and that you're prepared to at least try some of the things that are involved there.
Mm-hmm.
If someone's obstinate, I would suggest that they stay out of the music business and particularly stay away from being in front of ensembles, because you will be offensive and eventually you will fail. The world has changed from the autocratic, and we still see a lot of really demanding autocratic conductors. Most of the time, what they have in common is that people dislike them, disrespect them, and don't want to work with them.
Yeah, I agree with that. You mentioned, you told us a story once. I think you were presenting Saito at a conference, and Elizabeth Green was there.
When I presented at the Midwest Band Clinic back about 1989, she was the first person in the room. And she was very gracious. I didn't know at that point that she was dying of cancer, that she was spending as much time as she could revising revising her book for the last time. But I found her very open, and we had a nice short chat before the session began. she's also developed a vocabulary to describe some of the gestures. If you've looked at her book, so I was impressed by her manner, and I felt very fortunate to have an opportunity to be in the presence of somebody who had really tried to think through not only what the technique was, but also how it could be presented.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going a little bit of a different direction, maybe a little slightly less serious with this one. What is the strangest gesture you've had to use when you were conducting a piece? Like, have you ever had something where you had to sort of create your own gesture, or have you found that just sticking strictly to the textbook has served your needs for all musical situations?
Well, first of all, I presume you're talking about conducting an orchestra, choir, or band. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And is it you're talking about in a performance?
Yeah, like in a performance setting or a rehearsal setting.
Well, first of all, I don't choreograph what I'm going to do. I've learned that what we're doing is in the moment and is symbiotic. So the hardest part is to make sure that I'm communicating visually as well as gesturally with the people who are going to be the real foundation of what we're dealing with. So I've changed the placement of gestures. I've changed the type of gesture from into point to from point, just to make it a little bit easier during that particular time. And fortunately, I've been able to avoid incredible train wrecks. But in other cases, there was one time where I just I was working with a professional ensemble, and it was one of those multi-metered pieces that was less predictable than I wish that it had been. And basically, all I did was just give a constant downbeat until the ensemble could listen to each other and make it all fit together. I wanted to avoid the train wreck.
Yes, for sure. You've never had the opposite situation where you felt like you just had some crazy idea for a new gesture, like in the performance?
There have been a couple of performances where everything was so magical that I had to be very careful that I didn't do something that would derail what was already going on so fabulously. Mm-hmm. So it's in that kind of situation where we really think about what does the ensemble need?
Yeah.
Oh, do they need something that's big and fancy, or do they just need something where I would stand and smile? And frankly, there have been a couple of occasions like that where smiling, nodding, confirming that the stuff was really, really happening. Everybody senses that anyway. Yeah. And so, yeah, I want to make sure that what I do is not going to create problems for the performers. And so many times I've seen these extraordinary gestures that seem to look fabulous, but when you really listen to the ensemble, they don't understand it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's where it maybe becomes more about being careful it doesn't turn into a show rather than focused on the music.
Yeah, and some conductors like to put on a show, and as long as the ensemble is of the type where it doesn't matter, then that's fine. I guess one of the things that I think is critical is that we need to work hard to learn from everybody. Mm-hmm. So one of the people who influenced me greatly was Georg Tintner. And I would think that most people who worked with him liked his ideas, liked him as a human being, but wouldn't suggest that he had fabulous baton technique. But I watched how he enabled players to take over some of the functions. And in one piece that we did, it was a Puccini piece, he enabled our percussionist to make the transition from one section to the other and just taught him what he needed to be able to do. And so it became a partnership more than anything else.
For sure.
You posted a video of conducting exercise number one,
Yes.
and that was misunderstood. A lot of people didn't understand that it was a technical exercise. So, do you want to say what the purpose of that exercise is?
Do I understand it?
Oh no, a lot of people didn't understand
Yes.
what the purpose was. And did you want to like clarify for that video, like that it was like a technical exercise with a specific purpose?
There are people who are not interested in exploring other ideas.
Uh-huh.
They certainly have a dogmatic approach to things. I've suggested that sometimes there are dialects of conducting, but there are other people who are simply not interested. I work really hard when I watch conductors to celebrate the things that they bring to it and make work. And it doesn't necessarily have to fit with what we're doing with the Saito conducting method.
Mm-hmm.
There are some fundamental things about how they time their gestures and so on. But, you know, I found that the people responding, I just invited them to show me how they would do an exercise such as that. And nobody responded. So I won't worry about them.
Yeah.
The world of trolls.
That's right.
Uh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of trolls, your turn.
My turn. I'm up. Trolls up now. All right. This is my last question that I have. What is the biggest piece of advice that you would give to somebody who's interested in learning about the Saito method?
I would suggest that they buy a big mirror and watch what they do, and then get some friends together and do any kind of ensemble. Could be vocal or hand clapping or whatever. And try to work on some very specific things. One of the specific things might be to conduct so that it's easy for all of the ensemble to count in subdivision. So 1-E-ended, 2-E-ended, 3-E-ended. In other words, try to get some kind of feedback. The other would be to contact people who have studied the method, discuss some of these kinds of things. I think that I recognize how fortunate I was to have people such as Professor Okabe and a lot of my colleagues in my life, so that you get that kind of feedback. The other thing that's critically important that both of you have done is to get an ensemble that you can work with. Until you've had an opportunity to practice with an ensemble, all of the other little technical things that you can develop aren't meaningful. So working with an ensemble, understanding the depth of challenges that we face. So sometimes a challenge can be dealt with by smiling at the group. Other times it can be done with a much more clear kind of gesture. But conducting has all of those facets. I've often said when I met Joseph Silverstein in Japan, he's the kind of guy I'd like to go fishing with. You know, a brilliant raconteur, someone who is open. And I think that from that perspective, if we want to model that, then that's what people have to start to think about, as opposed to being the one and all knowledgeable kind of person who can put everybody else down. So a large part of it is getting involved in any way, conducting an ensemble, and then also working with someone who is knowledgeable, who can share all kinds of the dimensions of conducting with you.
And then the third thing would be come to the workshop, right?
We'd love to have people there. You know, it's been exciting for me that we've already had quite a few registrations this year. And, you know, the opportunity to build that collegial relationship between people is incredible.
And the
Yep.
workshop takes place when and where?
This year in Saskatoon, Canada, from July 21 to 28. That's the international workshops sponsored by the Saskatchewan Orchestral Association. And of course, the wonderful aspect of this is that the Orchestral Association has provided a grant that allows me to hire a string orchestra of professionals from Saskatoon. And it is a very unique kind of circumstance.
Yeah, they're really fun to work with. They're really, really talented.
Yep. They're so good too. And then the cool thing too is that they've done it so much that they start giving feedback, right? Like they
Yeah.
then to understand the gestures and know what's clear and what's not. So
Yeah,
And
it's
I'm
a
also,
real pleasure to work with them for sure.
I've worked with George Harpanche for so many years, probably 4 decades by now. And I find that he and I have sometimes a slightly different approach to things, but it's always helpful and constructive.
yeah.
We have a wonderful team of pianists. This year, in addition to Michelle, we have Janet going to be playing. And Janet took the course a few years ago. She's a brilliant musician, and I think people will really enjoy having a chance to work with her. So we would welcome anybody. And I have a number of things that I share with people online, some documents that I prepared for conferences that I'm happy to give to people. And if I can be of some assistance, I think that that displays more than anything my desire to change the situation of teaching conducting, which frankly doesn't work, hasn't benefited the wide range of conductors, and more importantly, the ensembles and the audience.
Um,
If you're thinking about doing the workshop, if you're watching this and thinking about it, just do it. Just throwing that out there.
I wasn't sure at first. Like I wanted to go to a workshop in Canada, and I kind of saw this one. Then when I went, it changed like the course of my life because I saw it and I was like, wow, this is the real stuff I want to learn. So going to the workshop for me like took my life, and it was like, so,
I know, and now you're at the point where your whole life is going to be about doing a podcast with me, so it's great.
sure. You want to ask the final question?
Oh, is that me?
Yeah.
Okay, The final question was what we were all going to share what our favorite gesture is. That was the final question, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want me to show you my favorite gesture?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're all going to share a favorite gesture. Yeah.
Well, I was always interested after having watched Mr. Akiyama do Hinyari. So I don't know if you could see the end of it. It's like a stabbing motion. And of course, it's very dramatic. But I also loved the ending that Naoto Tomo would give, which was at the end. So there are two favorite gestures.
Love it. I think I changed my mind, although I'm not sure. We were talking about this before, and I was trying to decide what's my favorite. I was like, I really like Senyu. Trying to decide between Hanayaga or Senyu, which one I enjoy more. I mean, I love fast pieces, so doing Hanayaga is always really fun, but
We can't see, by the way. You'll have to move back.
no, my laptop is not far enough. Let's try that. How about that? Is that better? My baton's white, so
We can see it better.
a little better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or doing like a Senyu. I just love Senyu. Always fun to work on. So I've noticed when I conduct my my church choir that I like to throw those in sometimes. Be like, oh, I used a Senyu there. All right. Well, that was fun.
It's nice when you don't have to think about it. It just happens.
It just kind of happens. Yep.
At my Christmas concert, I recently got a Senyu to work really well with a large ensemble, and it felt like a big accomplishment
Yay.
It is. It's a huge accomplishment.
because it's a very subtle gesture, and to make it so clear that an ensemble will get it was pretty cool. But my favorite gesture right now, for some reason, is Hando Tataki Dome.
Okay.
It's fun for some reason. It's just drop, bounce, and it works really well for like an accident for mana.
Yeah. And if you have a chance to do it so that it ends up right now, your baton is dropping below the visual,
Uh,
but if you do it so that it stops there, boom, so you can still see it, as opposed to boom, and you can't see it. It's even more interesting.
um, yeah, so that's pretty much the end of the definitive interview with Wayne.
Thank you.